The Dore Lectures on Mental Science. By Thomas Troward. Lecture 11. The Shepherd and the Stone. Part 2 of 2. But the principle of the shepherd and the stone is not something hitherto unheard of which is only to come into existence in the future. If there were no manifestations of this principle in the past, we might question whether there were any such principle at all, but a careful study of the subject will show us that it has been at work all through the ages, sometimes in modes more immediately bearing the aspect of the shepherd, and sometimes in modes more immediately bearing the aspect of the stone, though the one always implies the other, for they are the same thing seen from different points of view. The subject is one of immense interest, but covering such a wide range of study that all I can do here is to point out that such a field of investigation exists and is worth exploration, and the exploration brings its reward with it, not only by putting us in possession of the key to the history of the past, but by showing us that it is the key to the history of the future also, and furthermore by making evident on a large scale the working of the same principle of spiritual law by cooperation with which we may facilitate the process of our own individual evolution. It thus adds a vivid interest to life, giving us something worth looking forward to and introducing us to a personal future which is not limited by the proverbial 60 years and 10. Now, we have seen that the first stage in the creative process is always that of feeling, a reaching out by the spirit in a particular direction, and therefore we may look for something of the same kind in the development of the great principle which we are now considering. And we find this first vague movement of this great principle in the intuitions of a particular race which appears from time immemorial to have combined the two characteristics of nomad wandering with their flocks and herds and the symbolization of their religious beliefs in monuments of stone. The monuments themselves have taken different forms in different countries and ages, but the identity of their symbolism becomes clear under careful investigation. Together with this symbolism we always find the nomad character of the builders and that they are invested with an aura of mystery and romance such as we find nowhere else, though we always find it surrounding these builders, even in countries so far apart as India and Ireland. Then, as we pass beyond the merely monumental stage, we find threads of historical evidence connecting the different branches of this race, increasing in their complexity and strengthening in their cumulative force as we go on, until at last we are brought to the history of the age in which we live, and finally most remarkable affinities of language put the finishing touch to the mass of proofs which can be gathered along all these different lines. In this magic circle countries so remote from one another as Ireland and Greece, Egypt and India, Palestine and Persia, are brought into close contiguity, a similar tradition, and even a similar nomenclature, unite the mysterious builders of the Great Pyramid with the equally mysterious builders of the Round Towers of Ireland, and the Great Pyramid itself, perhaps antedating the call of Abraham, reappears as the official seal of the United States, while tradition traces the crowning stone in Westminster Abbey back to the time of Solomon's Temple and even earlier. For the most part the erewhile wanderers are now settled in their destined homes, but the Anglo-Saxon race, the people of the cornerstone, are still the pioneers among the nations, and there is something esoteric in the old joke that when the North Pole is reached a Scotchman will be found there. And not least in the chain of evidence is the link afforded by a tribe who are wanderers still, the gypsies with their duplicate of the pyramid in the pack of cards, a volume which has been called the Devil's Picture Book by those who know it only in its misuse and inversion, but which when interpreted in the light of the knowledge we are now gaining, affords a signal instance of that divine policy by which, as St. Paul says, God employs the foolish things of this world to confute the wise, while a truer apprehension of the gypsies themselves indicates their unmistakable connection with that race who through all its wanderings has ever been the guardian of the stone. In these few paragraphs I have only been able to point out very briefly the broad lines of enquiry into a subject of national importance to the British and American peoples, and which interests us personally, not only as members of these nations, but as affording proof on the largest scale of the same specialization of universal laws which each of us has to effect individually for ourselves. But whether the process be individual or national it is always the same, and as the translation to the very highest plane, that of the all-originating life itself, of the old maxim that nature will obey us exactly in proportion as we first obey nature, it is the old parable of the Lord who, finding his servants girt and awaiting him, then girds himself and serves them. Luke verse 12. Chapter 35-37. The nation or the individual who thus realizes the true principle of the shepherd and the stone, comes under a special divine guidance and protection, not by a favoritism incompatible with the conception of universal law, but by the very operation of the law itself. They have come into touch with its higher possibilities, and to recur to an analogy which I have already employed, they learn to make their iron float by the very same law by which it sinks, and so they become the flock of the great shepherd and the building of the great architect, and each one, however insignificant his or her sphere may appear, becomes a sharer in the great work, and by a logical consequence begins to grow on new lines of development for the simple reason that a new principle necessarily produces new modes of manifestation. If the reader will think over these things, he will see that the promises contained in the Bible, whether national or personal, are nothing else than statements of the universal law of cause and effect applied to the inmost principles of our being, and that therefore it is not mere rhapsody, but the figurative expression of a great truth when the psalmist says, "The Lord is my shepherd, and Thou art my God and the rock of my salvation." Lecture 11. The Shepherd and the Stone. End of lecture. Need help understanding Troward's teachings? The Thomas Troward lectures contain very deep and powerful information, but to get the most out of them, require repeated listening and in-depth study. Troward had only one personal student, Genevieve Behrend, and her book Your Invisible Power distills the essence of Troward's lectures in a concise and easy-to-understand format. For many, this is a much preferred way to learn Troward's teachings. Click the link below this video to visit yourinvisiblepower.us and learn more about Genevieve Behrend's recently updated book.